an election special with John Solomon.
All right, folks, welcome back to our Just the News Real America's Voice special, The Count, the Court, and the Constitution. I'm John Solomon, and I'm your host tonight. You just heard from the Trump legal team, all the challenges they're facing, all the evidence they have. Now we want to bring in someone who can help us digest the president's strategy, the renowned legal scholar, Alan Dershowitz. Alan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to play a clip for you and get your reaction to it. It's Rudy Giuliani on Fox Business earlier this week talking about the clock that's ticking down even as they pursue these legal challenges. Let's roll that tape.
You only have a few weeks, Rudy, because they want to certify the state elections early December. Do you believe you will be able to prosecute and be heard within this time frame?
Of course. And I can't imagine how a state legislature can certify based upon ballots where we had no opportunity to inspect, and it was done deliberately. I mean, the fact that it happened in all those states, right, tells you it was a plan. The crooked Democratic leaders in those 10 or 12 places where we were shut out didn't all develop that idea by themselves.
Alan, you've been on the biggest stage, argued some of the biggest cases before the Supreme Court, the Federal Appeals Court. Realistically, given that we're just a few weeks away from electors being chosen to choose the next president, do you think the president's team has enough time to make the sort of case to reverse votes to get some of these decisions locked down?
The clock is a double-edged sword in this election because if they don't have enough time, but if they can put forward a sufficiently strong case, then they may be able to get some Republican secretaries of state or legislatures to say, look, we just don't have enough time to certify these electors. And if they can bring down the number of electors, 35, 37 from the 305 and bring it down to 267, 268, then the election goes to the House where the Republicans win. So the goal here is to try to just make sure that by the date the electors meet and vote, there aren't 270 votes for Biden. There's no chance that Trump gets 270 in time for those days. That won't happen. The goal is to prevent Biden from getting 270, and that's why the clock is a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it clearly is a challenge for them. And as you look out now, it seems like they've settled in on a strategy, and that strategy appears to be challenging the unequal protection or challenging that voters didn't get equal protection in this election, that there were some voters who had their votes counted with observers there, some who weren't, some who followed certain rules from the Secretary of State, some who didn't. How strong an argument is that going into the Federal Appeals Court where they'll eventually be in a few days or weeks?
Well, it's intriguing because they certainly have the United States Supreme Court, Bush versus Gore, on their side. Bush versus Gore did rule that counting Chads differently raised equal protection problems. I'm not sure that was the right decision. I wrote a book about it called Justice, but that's the law. To complicate things, the Supreme Court said, no, that's not the law. That's just the way we decide this case. Don't ever dare to cite that case for precedent in future cases. But now that's the most important case, and it's going to be cited in this case because the equal protection argument really is based, both arguments, the equal protection argument and the Article 2 argument saying that only state legislatures, not courts, can determine the conditions for voting. They'll both be influenced by Bush versus Gore, a 20-year-old case.
When you look at that argument, if they get past the legal threshold and the court says, all right, listen, we think you got a point here, the next challenge then I guess becomes, can you show that enough fraud or irregularities or improper votes were cast to actually swing any one of these 3 or 4 elections where they're challenging in Michigan or Pennsylvania, Georgia? How hard or how high is the threshold for the evidence they'll need to bring into the court, particularly if they get to the Supreme Court, to convince a court that, yes, throw out those ballots, tens of thousands of ballots, and let's throw this to the House?
Well, it will depend on the numbers. Take Pennsylvania. Already we have a ruling from Justice Alito, who's the circuit justice covering Pennsylvania, that the votes have to be segregated. The votes that were made before the close of business on Election Day but received 3 days after that, those votes are segregated. If the number of those votes exceeds the margin of victory that Biden has over Trump currently, then the Supreme Court will reverse that vote and give Pennsylvania to Trump. That will not be enough. In order to deny Biden the 270, he'll need to win Pennsylvania and Georgia and at least one other state, Michigan or Nevada or Arizona or Wisconsin. And that will depend on what the numbers are. Now, there's another challenge that's being made. It was argued mostly by Sidney Powell. You know, he's the president. Lucky he has excellent lawyers on his team. And by the way, nobody should criticize his lawyers for taking these cases. This effort to bar these lawyers is pure, simple McCarthyism, and just people shouldn't be doing that. But if he can make those arguments about the fraudulent computer, then it's a completely different ballgame, because then you're dealing with potentially hundreds of thousands of votes. But I haven't seen the evidence yet in support of that. I've heard the allegations, but when you get to court, you have to have more than hearsay affidavits. You have to have hard evidence, and whether that evidentiary threshold can be met, we'll have to wait and see.
And when you look at there was an affidavit recently submitted by a woman named Jessie Jacob out of Detroit. She was an election worker. She said she participated in and witnessed, and she participated at the instruction of her supervisors in the backdating of thousands of ballots the day after the election. How important could an eyewitness like that, somebody who was actually involved in the process, not observing, could that have any impact when we get to a Michigan case?
Sure, but it would require the taking of evidence. She will testify, but then others will testify, and maybe they'd be contradictory testimony, and then a judge or a jury would have to resolve those issues. I suspect it would go mostly in front of a judge, because these are going to be injunction cases, not cases for common law damages. And so you could move that process pretty quickly if you don't require a jury.
Yeah, no, that'll be important. Are you convinced that this is going to end up at the Supreme Court, that these 3 or 4 states are going to all end up before the Supreme Court? Is that where this legal trail ends?
If the numbers are there, not if the numbers aren't. The Supreme Court's not going to issue an advisory opinion. They're not going to issue a moot opinion. They're not going to give Trump a Pyrrhic victory. The plaintiffs are going to have to show that there are enough votes to impact the outcome of the election in a given state. If that happens, yes, it will go to the Supreme Court. And yes, I think at least under the constitutional challenge, the Article 2 challenge in Pennsylvania, they have a pretty good chance of winning.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've heard that from a lot of people today. A lot of people say, well, this is a long shot. This is a Hail Mary. Obviously, the odds are long. But in the last year, we've had 2 cases where elections have been thrown out. And now we just heard of a third one last night in Nevada. So you got North Carolina, where a House election was thrown out, Paterson, New Jersey, where a local city election was thrown out, and now a county election in Newark. In Nevada, do you think that those cases give some backdrop, some confidence to the American people if something dramatic happens? Hey, it isn't the first time?
Yeah, and remember, if you watched Sunday football this week, a game was won by a Hail Mary pass. I remember Flutie, the Immaculate Reception. As a football fan, Hail Marys are the way some of the greatest games in history have ended. So even if the Trump team has to throw Hail Marys, as long as there's a receiver downfield in the end zone on the Supreme Court, and that's, of course, why President Trump wanted so much for the 9th Justice to be put on the Supreme Court. That 9th Justice, I think he sees as the recipient of the Hail Mary pass, potentially. We don't know how she'll vote. Justices have a way of disappointing people who appointed them. We know that Bill Clinton was disappointed when justices he appointed ruled that he had to be deposed in the case involving Paula Jones. So you never know how the justices of the Supreme Court.
A quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to have our expert panel here to talk things over about everything we just heard. We'll be right back to you.
An election special with John Solomon.